Opening the center creates immediate diagonal influence. Instantly mirroring white's pawn advance establishes central presence and opens lines for immediate piece development. Developing a knight here sets up central pawn breaks and prepares for castling, aiming for harmonious piece activity. Developing the knight here firmly contests the center and signals a readiness to engage in the game's unfolding positional struggles, asserting central control and immediately challenging black's pawn structure, preparing for a dynamic queenside expansion. Securing the queen's pawn with this solid defense prepares for a robust central structure, aiming to blunt white's aggressive intentions and build a stable pawn formation. Securing the central pawn with a knight offers flexibility, setting up rapid development and potential queenside pressure. Releasing central tension, black initiates a strategic retreat to a potentially less active pawn structure, inviting immediate positional questions. Claiming central space with the pawn advance creates immediate diagonal pressure on black's queenside, unerringly aiming at the weak c4 pawn. This bishop immediately seeks active development and exerts pressure on white's central structure, boldly challenging black's bishop. This maneuver ignites immediate central conflict and opens avenues for swift piece development, aiming to exploit any lack of coordination in black's camp by creating a dynamic tension that black must address with precision. Defending the queen's knight pawn with this knight allows for a more harmonious development, avoiding the potential pin on the d7 square and preparing to recapture the pawn should white play e3 to support the knight. The knight now eyes the crucial e5 square, offering an immediate counter-threat and signaling black's intent to contest the center and potentially exchange pieces to relieve pressure. Retrieving the pawn opens up the e-file for potential activity and clears a path for the queen. But it also grants black's bishop an unhindered diagonal, potentially creating future attacking opportunities against white's king. Steering the knight towards the weakened b6 square offers a dual purpose, eyeing the c4 pawn while simultaneously preparing to contest control of the central squares or shift pressure to the queenside. It's a dynamic repositioning, accepting temporary inactivity to build for future challenges, and avoids the immediate tension around the center. Stepping back, white re-engages the knight, aiming to disrupt black's developing harmony and reclaim central influence while creating potential threats towards the kingside. Solidifying the knight's advanced outpost while simultaneously limiting white's queenside expansion offers a robust positional foundation. Anchoring the pawn structure with f3 offers some protection to the king's diagonal but simultaneously weakens the e3 square and delays crucial central development, reclaiming the central square and forcing white's knight to retreat. This maneuver re-establishes black's influence and prepares for future pawn advances. The knight's repositioning offers flexibility, potentially aiming for c5 or e5 again, while also defending the crucial e6 square. It's a quiet positional adjustment that builds pressure subtly, aiming to control key diagonals and prepare for castling. Striking the knight on d7 simplifies the position, opening lines and creating a clear path for the queen to potentially infiltrate later. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight stabilizes black's central presence, creating a more robust pawn structure and freeing the bishop on c8 from its initial restriction, while simultaneously challenging white's knight superiority and opening lines for potential future counterplay on the queenside. Unlocking the center now, white asserts control with this pawn thrust, aiming to cramp black's pieces and open lines for potential attacks while simultaneously reinforcing the d4 pawn. Finally, black confronts the central pawn advance, acknowledging the pressure white has exerted. The bishop vacates its somewhat passive square, aiming to redeploy its influence, perhaps towards the kingside or to support a central pawn push later. This repositions the piece to a more active diagonal, contesting white's central grip and opening avenues for further development. The bishop's development to e3 gracefully reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares for a potential castling maneuver, while simultaneously eyeing the queenside where black's pawn structure is somewhat less harmonious. After a5, allowing the e6 pawn push clarifies black's immediate development, reinforcing the d5 structure and opening a diagonal for the bishop on c8, though it does slightly reduce the influence of the knight on d7 by creating a pawn chain, consolidating the queenside pawn structure while bringing the bishop closer to central action forms. The core idea behind this development, seeking to unravel white's central control, black redirects their bishop to a more active diagonal, immediately challenging the light-squared control around the white king and eyeing potential tactical opportunities arising from the cramped knight on d7. Safeguarding the monarch becomes paramount, tucking it away behind a wall of pawns to prepare for future struggles. Securing the king with castling initiates a period of relative stability, allowing black to consolidate the bishop's influence from g6 and begin a thoughtful development of the remaining pieces, especially considering white's pawn structure on the kingside and the potential for central tension to escalate. Unleashing the queen to b3 immediately puts pressure on black's queenside pawns, specifically eyeing the c6 pawn and potentially creating a battery with the c4 pawn if black isn't careful. This proactive stance aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and force concessions, a typical strategy when the opponent has developed their bishop to g6, potentially creating weaknesses. Seeking to unpin the queen and prepare for a potential b6 maneuver to contest the queenside. This move also shores up the e6 pawn and anticipates a central pawn push by white, asserting control over the central file. The rook now eyes potential breakthroughs, preparing to support pawn advances or join attacks along the c-file as the queenside structures begin to solidify. Finally, some much-needed activity for black's rook, aiming to occupy the central file and connect with the other rook. This repositioning also shores up the kingside a bit, indirectly supporting the f-pawn and preparing for potential pawn pushes later. It's a flexible maneuver that keeps options open, rather than committing to a specific attacking or defensive structure just yet. Unlocking the c-file for your rook while simultaneously pressuring black's e6 pawn. This maneuver establishes a crucial foothold and sharpens white's attacking ambitions. The c-file, now potentially open, becomes a focal point, and placing the rook here immediately contests its control, hinting at future aggressive operations or defensive reinforcement of the queenside. The knight embarks on a curious journey, sacrificing immediate central influence for a potential outpost on d4 or c5. A gamble that might leave the d-file less defended. Black's bishop retreats to a more active diagonal, eyeballing that often vulnerable d4 pawn and preparing to potentially contest the c-file should white choose to open it. Unleashing a pawn storm with g4 on the queenside signals an aggressive intent to exploit the perceived weakness of black's bishop placement, aiming to gain space and potentially disrupt black's defensive structure before launching a direct assault on the king. A daring gambit to expose the castled king, sacrificing the bishop for immediate tactical chaos and a potential assault on the h-file. The king abandons the safety of the castled position, a risky gamble that exposes the monarch to potential threats along the g-file and across the light squares. Reorganizing the bishop to a more passive square signals a shift in focus, potentially preparing to contest the central dark squares or offer it up for exchange later. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside. White forcefully pushes the e-pawn, aiming to pry open lines towards black's king and seize control of central space. This aggressive thrust immediately challenges black's development and forces a reaction, potentially creating weaknesses in the pawn structure around the king. The spatial advantage gained could prove decisive if white can effectively exploit the newly opened avenues. A crucial retreat. The bishop seeks a safer haven on f8, temporarily abandoning the a7 diagonal where its presence was becoming precarious under white's growing central pressure and potential attacking formations along the kingside. The knight's journey to g3 is an interesting development, aiming to reinforce the kingside and potentially pressure black's weakened pawn structure or prepare a further kingside pawn advance like h4. White is clearly looking to seize the initiative and create imbalances, shifting focus from the queenside activity seen earlier. This repositioning also frees up the f3 square for a potential pawn push, adding another attacking threat. It's a solid positional maneuver designed to build pressure gradually, anticipating black's need to defend key squares. Seizing the initiative on the queenside. This maneuver looks to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines against their king. The queen now eyes squares that could become targets, forcing white to consider their defensive setup. Pushing forward with the f-pawn now dramatically alters the pawn structure, aiming to pry open the kingside for white's pieces and potentially exploit black's slightly compromised king safety. The queen's departure here abandons the c-file for black, a significant relinquishment in a position already characterized by white's territorial advantage. This exchange, while simplifying the material, effectively neutralizes black's only actively placed queen, leaving them with a somewhat passive setup where pieces like the bishop on g6 might find themselves awkwardly placed without the queen's support. White, on the other hand, will likely consolidate their central influence and potentially exploit the semi-open c-file with their rook, leading to greater piece activity. Reclaiming the bishop on the queenside solidifies white's central structure and prepares for potential pawn advances, while black's queen now finds itself awkwardly placed, lacking active squares. Black's pawn thrust on f6 creates a critical tension, immediately challenging white's centralized pawn and potentially opening lines for counterplay, though it simultaneously weakens the light squares around the king. Reclaiming the central square with the bishop, white prepares to challenge black's initiative. Embracing the central pawn exchange, black intentionally simplifies, opening the f-file and daring white to exploit the newfound space. This move signals a shift from queenside skirmishes to a potential battle in the center, where the king's protection might become a concern if white's pieces can coordinate effectively. The freeing of the dark squared bishop from its cramped diagonal suggests black is preparing for more dynamic pawn play, aiming to disrupt white's seemingly solid structure. Liberating the e-pawn opens a critical diagonal for white's queen and bishop. Seizing the initiative after a somewhat passive sequence and introducing new attacking possibilities on the kingside. Reclaiming the central square with the knight immediately opens up possibilities for piece activity, and contests the crucial e5 outpost that white worked hard to establish. The rook capture on c5 immediately dissolves the central pawn tension and opens a critical diagonal for the enemy queen, creating a dynamic endgame scenario where piece activity will be paramount. The recapture immediately opens the c-file, transforming white's previously robust pawn shield into a potential target for black's rooks. igniting a dynamic confrontation. This thrust immediately challenges black's central pawn and seeks to exploit the awkward placement of the knight on circa 5. White is aiming to shatter the pawn structure and create open lines for the rook and queen, potentially leading to an attack on black's king, which is somewhat exposed behind its pawn shield. The aggressive advance also gains vital space on the kingside, pushing black's pieces back and limiting their maneuvering options. Recognizing the precariousness of white's extended pawn structure, black wisely repositions the bishop to safety, seeking to consolidate after the exchange on the c-file and prepare for potential central pawn breaks. The knight's repositioning to e4 offers a potent dual threat, eyeing both the d6 bishop and the f6 square for potential breakthroughs. Bolstering the queenside pawn structure becomes paramount, creating a defensive barrier against white's encroaching knights and securing the b6 square for future maneuvers. Unleashing the knight forward seizes the initiative on the kingside, preparing a potential kingside pawn storm or a decisive knight maneuver into enemy territory. Initiating a counterattack along the open d-file. This move aims to disrupt white's established pawn structure and introduce active counterplay for black's rook. Unleashing the bishop to claim the c3 square initiates a battle for central dominance, aiming to disrupt black's knight's influence and potentially open lines for a pawn thrust. Sensing an opportunity, black redirects the now liberated rook to a vital central file, creating immediate pressure on white's advanced pawn chain and hinting at a potential breakthrough that could unravel white's queenside pawn majority. This capture definitively severs black's last connection to the kingside pawn chain, creating an isolated d-pawn for white while simultaneously opening the crucial c-file for white's rook, which can now exert significant pressure along it towards black's now exposed queen. Opening the c-file now presents a double-edged sword. While it finally activates the rook, the newly exposed king offers a juicy target for white's knight, potentially leading to a swift attack. Unlocking the central files is crucial now, as the pawn push clears the path for the rook to join the assault on the weakened dark squares surrounding black's monarch, promising an aggressive initiative. Re-establishing the bishop on a more active diagonal, threatening to disrupt white's past pawn potential and regain some central influence. Securing the central files now dominates white's agenda, aiming to dismantle black's precarious pawn structure before their king finds sanctuary. Responding to the rook's intrusion, black seeks to create some breathing room and potentially shore up the kingside by pushing the h-pawn, a move that simultaneously addresses the immediate threat and prepares for future pawn breaks. Seeking to activate its beleaguered knight towards a more useful diagonal, this maneuver aims to pry open the king's position further by potentially creating weaknesses on the kingside should it find a way to advance or exchange itself favorably. Boldly repositioning the bishop to the active e4 square, black aims to exploit the temporary weakness on the g2 square and potentially disrupt white's attacking setup before the pawn advance on the kingside gets too dangerous. Shifting the king to the third rank allows it to participate in defending the vulnerable e-pawn and prepares a potential escape square should black's rook become too aggressive. Bringing the rook to the second rank, the black monarch's central safety is now the paramount concern for both sides. Re-establishing pressure on the queenside with the knight reassures the pawn structure, creating potential for a future kingside advance once the knight finds a more active square. Solidifying your pawn structure before venturing further into this complicated middle game is a sensible decision, creating a more robust defense for your king and preventing any immediate tactical breakthroughs by white's knight. Re-establishing a central knight presence aims to shore up the d-pawn's defense and potentially squares like e5 or d4. Steering the rook to the 8th rank is a shrewd maneuver, aiming to anchor it on a square where it can exert maximum pressure and potentially support a pawn's advance, while simultaneously preparing for a defensive redeployment if the opponent's initiative escalates. Unleashing the knight to d4 immediately challenges the pawn chain and opens up threats against the queen and king's defensive structure. Initiating a forceful sequence, black opts to activate the rook, aiming to consolidate its position on the 8th rank and potentially contest the open d-file. A bold choice given white's threatening pawn structure. Re-establishing control over the central files and preparing for a potential pawn push seems to be the priority. The rook now swings to the kingside to support a potential pawn push or simply to gain attacking scope. Repositioning the rook to the 2nd rank aims to contest the crucial open file and prepare for potential incursions into black's territory. Shifting the king to a more active central square offers valuable defensive support and opens avenues for counterplay. Activating the knight to control the crucial central squares and prepare for further infiltration. Unleashing a final flourish. Black's rook charges onto the king's path, creating an immediate threat that forces white's monarch out of its temporary safety. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount after the recent flurry of exchanges. Preventing any immediate discoveries or checks along the newly opened diagonal. Reactivating the bishop's potential provides crucial support for the pawn structure and opens pathways for counterplay. Initiating a regrouping maneuver. The knight abandons its post on d2, aiming to reposition towards the kingside, potentially supporting an eventual kingside pawn advance or reinforcing key squares that have become vulnerable. King's safety is severely compromised with this piece venturing so far forward, exposing the monarch to a barrage of attacks. Securing the monarch behind a pawn shield is a reasonable instinct, but it leaves the king exposed to potential knight forks and allows black's bishop to remain a potent attacker. A daring sortie into white's king's vicinity, aiming to disrupt the defensive structure and perhaps force an early conclusion through aggressive piece activity. Embracing the immediate danger, white offers a potential sacrifice to disrupt the relentless assault on the king. The bishop slides into its ideal square, a positional pivot threatening to unlock the queen's rook and potentially disrupt white's central pawns. A desperate attempt to dislodge the black king from its comfortable perch. The black king, now exposed and vulnerable, is desperately trying to find refuge behind its beleaguered pawns after white's aggressive e-pawn push. Reactivating the rook to the 2nd rank now seizes the open file, threatening to infiltrate black's weakened defenses and exploit the pinned king. Hoping to lure the king out into the open, the rook now makes a daring sortie, but it might have been more prudent to maintain a defensive posture, guarding the pawn that could still prove problematic. King's safety is paramount now. The monarch must retreat to a more sheltered square. Pushing the pawn here is a bold attempt to open lines for the rook, creating a passed pawn on the h-file. It demands meticulous calculation to ensure the king remains secure, as the advanced pawn might also become a target or a shield depending on the subsequent exchanges. This pawn's relentless march to the 7th rank creates immediate royal discomfort, threatening to become an unstoppable force and simplifying the position into a favorable endgame scenario by forcing the black king into a more restricted area. The pawn's audacious advance to d4 aims to dislodge the entrenched bishop and create a dynamic rift in white's otherwise solid pawn structure, potentially opening lines for the black rooks.